Is Mr.
Thank you. I was about to move on to another Gold Group meeting, which took place in the afternoon at 14:40 hours.
Okay.
And if we look at the minutes of that Gold Group meeting, first of all, that's PS 07268. See again that you were present with the ACC, Bull Campbell were there again. Detective Chief Inspector Houston was there.
Yep.
What was his role?
I think he was Pat Campbell's deputy.
Right. And would he have been a crime scene, to organise crime scene management of the...
He could well have been. He we spoke earlier about bronze commanders. If he was doing crime scene, he would be the bronze probably lead for that.
Right. And then you've talked about Nicola Shepherd, you've talked about Robson, and then we see that at this meeting, Keith Harrower was there from Perk. And we've also heard that John Ferguson was from Perk as well. Do you remember that?
I don't actually, but...
No. And then someone called Keith Hardy was there from MIT.
Yeah.
He's given evidence as well.
Okay.
And so this was the first Gold Group meeting that Perk had attended. And if we look further down, you'll see in the minutes, there's reference to the terms of reference, but on this occasion, at this stage, the reference to reputation and ensuring reputation, that had been removed by then. And do you remember any more discussion about that matter?
No, just simply, as I touched on before, terms of reference can be an evolving document, so that doesn't surprise me. And then, the final bullet there, which brings the Perk into the equation that wasn't on the original from memory.
All right, so this is the first involvement of Perk, really, in terms of the Gold attendance at the Gold Group meeting. Do you remember when Perk had first arrived in Kirkcaldy?
I don't actually know.
No. But they were there by this
Yes.
meeting. Can we look at your inquiry statement, please? If we can have that on the screen again, 258. And if we can look, first of all, at paragraph 44. And I'm going to look at a few paragraphs in this section, but let's start with 44, where you talk about the first time Perk attended was... and then 45, thank you. I didn't know what Perk were going to be doing until they arrived, but I expected them to come in and take overall command of the investigation. I expected them to possibly require support from our resources during the initial stage, but that would have been one for the investigation to decide. My sense was that Perk were struggling to manage the incident. That's not meant as a criticism of Perk. They were pretty new at that point, but I felt they didn't have the resources and potentially the experience in certain aspects. And I'm interested in exploring this paragraph with you. So until Perk arrived and then attended this meeting, how would you describe the communication and the level of information you were getting from Perk in your position as Silver Commander?
Prior to the Gold meeting?
Yes.
Nothing.
No
I'd had no
at all.
contact. No, and that, in fairness to Perk, was probably not unrealistic at that early stage. I was aware from Pat Campbell that he had a number of discussions with Perk, so I was content with that.
All right. And you'd expected them to come in and take overall command of the investigation. And what would that have looked like in Kirkcaldy?
So in a real sort of, in a basic sense, is for Keith and his team to come in, to be afforded, time to understand the background to the incident as well as what had been done until that point, but thereafter for them to take the lead and to make the decisions moving forward. That ultimately Perk are independent from policing, and a death such as this following police contact required an independent review. So by default, they need to be driving forward the inquiry.
So if that independence was required from PERC, as it is in this occasion it was, did you have concerns about the fact that the police had continued or commenced the investigation from the events happening 7:20 in the morning, and this is 2:40 in the afternoon?
I didn't have concerns as such. I was a bit of a realist at the time. I mean, PERC were a very young organisation. They didn't have a huge level of resource, but my mindset was, let's not try and present this to be something that's not. PERC are either in command of this incident or they're not. And my understanding was that they were in command of it, but due to the limited specialist resource that they had, we had resources available that under their direction we could deploy on their behalf.
What do you mean by the term specialist resource?
So it could be anything. It could be crime scene. You touched on crime scene manager there. Now, I don't know the answer to this, but that would be an example where PERC may or may not, in May of 2015, have fully trained and qualified crime scene managers available. I don't know if they did, but if they didn't, then it would not be unreasonable at that point for Police Scotland to assist with that, but under the direction of PERC. So, it's not true independent inquiry. It's co-joined, but for me, with PERC as the lead agency, is probably a better description back in 2015.
When you say not a true independent matter, what would you, if you were looking to create a true independent inquiry or review into the actions of the police that day, what would you have expected?
Yeah, so if it was a true and independent inquiry, then PERC would come in at whatever time, let's just say at 11:30, they would rightly be afforded a brief, and then they would take control, oversight of all aspects of the investigation, but they would have the resources to fulfil that obligation, and they didn't in 2015.
And in terms of resources, can you perhaps help us with a comparison? What resources the police had and what resources you saw the PERC having? Yeah, so I mean, in its broadest sense, one of the advantages of the creation of Police Scotland was that you had access to resources. I can't remember the number now, but hypothetically speaking, 20,000 members of staff. Now, I'm not saying you would galvanise all them for this inquiry, but you had access to all these varied and vast experiences. When PERC arrived on the day, I think there was 5 of them. So, And am I right in saying that earlier this morning you'd said that when a critical incident is declared, that you can pull in resources from all around the country?
Yes.
Does that just mean Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, if we did need mutual aid, as we did previously, we sent officers from Scotland down to, touched on Manchester and Birmingham previously, we supplied resources down there. So, if there was an occasion where that merited it, which was not in this one, then we could probably go further afield.
Mm. You say there, I expected them to possibly require support from our resources during the initial stage. So what stage was that you were referring to? Because I've asked you about the period before they arrived. What do you mean when you say there during the initial stage? Just
the sort of the period from them arriving and the subsequent short period of time until they were in a position where they had the skill sets available to take it on. The reality is that at no time did they have the capacity to do it. That was the reality. At that time in 2015.
Right. And so when did you realise that really at no time they were going to have that capacity?
it was obvious from the minute they arrived. You know, when an independent investigating team arrive for an incident such as a scale, and there is 5 or 6 members of staff, you can see clearly that they're not going to have the capacity to push this forward.
Was there any discussion that took place about the lack of capacity that they had and the impact of that on the investigation?
There was certainly discussion. I had discussion with some of my team around that. I may or may not have direct discussion with Park. I'm not sure, and the reason I say that is because, you know, they are there to investigate the police. So we need, you know, the relationship is not a, you know, we're not on an even keel here. They are the investigators, and they're investigating an incident that involved the police. So there is a sort of, I don't know how quite to describe it, but, you know, we're not in each other's pockets.
Mm-hmm. And you've said, my sense was PERC were struggling to manage the incident. Tell us what you meant by that.
I think just the size, the scale, this is probably in policing history in Scotland, this is probably the first, thankfully, of its kind, and hopefully the last that I can certainly remember. So this is not an everyday traditional investigation that the PERC would get involved in. It's something far more serious and far more complex than that.
Mm. And what was it, if anything, that gave rise to this sense that you had that they were struggling? Was anything said or done?
It was just, well, one was the numbers, and two, I didn't have that comfort at certain points that they were focusing in on aspects that I maybe, as Silver and looking at the community side of things, were maybe, and the family, which I felt was more important.
Tell us about that.
So, yeah, I mean, the bottom line, as I mentioned earlier in the day, I mean, what is important to me, or should be important for me to a lot of people involved, is the family, the police officers, and the Sheikh's body. And these are three things, and probably the final one around that is the media around, you know, how back to the community reassurance, you know, what do we need to be, what do PERC need to be doing to provide some reassurance across communities?
So from your perspective, it was very important that PERC also had regard to the experience of the family and the community more widely.
Well, one affects the other. If you're doing the investigation, there can be decisions and actions initiated there that will by default have an impact on the family, will by default have an impact on wider community. So it's important that investigators take due regard of the possible consequences that could lead to some of their actions.
Right. And in the last sentence there at 45, you're talking about resources. Is that not just the resources, the number of staff they turned up with, but also whether they had access to the specialist resources that you had in the police?
Yes.
Any other issues about resources that you've not covered?
No, it was back to the skill sets and the experience. I mean, you know, Pat Campbell as an example and you know, Colin Robson, Graham Dursley, these are investigators who are right at the, you know, I would call people match fit. So I was an investigator at one point, but I'm no longer match fit because I've moved on to other roles and responsibilities. But Pat Campbell, Colin Robson, Graham Dursley are really match fit investigators, and there'd be very few people that have got the same skills and experience that they had at that particular moment. I don't think PERC, and it's no criticism to them because, you know, their staff will not have had the same present day experience and currency of experience than some of the names I've just mentioned.
We've heard that some of the staff employed by PERC were former officers. Did you know many of them?
I didn't know them personally. I knew some were and, had been previous officers in Legacy, Strathclyde Police, etc.
Did you know about what experience or rank they had achieved in their previous roles?
There was probably some talk of it at the time, to be honest with you. I can't remember now, but, because there were some police officers that had worked with and or had experience in many years before as some of the PERC people, so there was a bit of chat around their experience.
So you've talked about the rank and experience of Campbell and Robson and Dursley. Was you, in terms of your impression of the staff that came from PERC that day, do you feel they matched that rank or experience?
So I genuinely, hand on heart, don't think they did, and it's not a criticism of they just didn't have that currency of experience. We had, as I say, Pat Campbell, who was dealing with the most serious crime on literally a daily basis. Now, there's probably no one else anywhere that you could get that would have that same level and currency. And, Colin and D.S. Dursley and that, they're in exactly the same boat. I would never even compare myself at that point to their level of current experience.
Thank you. And then at paragraph 46, you go on to detail that the most important aspect for me was the community impact, reassurance, the family side of things. I wasn't overly impressed by their initial inaction in the early stages towards the family. You're referring to PERC here. I thought they'd failed to prioritise what I thought was important, which was the family, which in turn affects the community impact and the ability to give community reassurance. In terms of what you've said here, you say not overly impressed by their initial inaction in the early stages towards the family. What would you have expected to happen?
So what I would have expected or hoped to happen there would have been family liaison officers deployed many hours before they were to the family, and to try and to begin to build that relationship with them and to keep them abreast of how the inquiry and the incident was progressing.
And when you say many hours before they were, could you help the chair understand what you think would a reasonable time scale would be? If the events had occurred by about 7:30 in the morning.
Yeah. So, I mean, if I was, if I had been the detective super, or, you'd be looking to deploy flows within a scenario like this within 2 hours, I would suspect. You really want to get flows in early and begin to build that relationship and that trust.
And is that the benefit of deploying them early?
It's certainly one of the benefits. And different inquiries require different responses. I definitely accept that. But with this inquiry in particular, there was no reason why flows should not have been deployed early.
And can I just be clear in my own mind? Obviously, the incident had taken place by about 7:30 in the morning. Life wasn't pronounced extinct until shortly after 9 in the morning. When you're talking about a sort of 2-hour window of deploying flows, would that be from the 7:30 or from the 9ish in the morning?
No, I would say by the 9ish.
By the 9.
Yeah, you would
so
only
round about 11, before midday.
Yes.
Right, thank you. And you were talking about the benefits of the flow being appointed. Can you elaborate on that for us? We've still to hear evidence from a flow.
Right. Yeah, I mean, flow, it's not a new skill set, but it's a really important skill set, and insofar as that, a flow is there, they have sort of two main tracks. One is to build that relationship with the family, to build trust and confidence, and to really try and ensure that everything that they're asking for within reason, we as as the investigating authority will try and fulfil. So that's one aspect. And two is then to look to build some antecedent histories, I would call it, the sort of background, get a picture of, you know, on this occasion it would be Sheik and his family and who he was, you know, what sort of man he was, just build the so we had a greater understanding of him and his wider family.
And can I ask you to look at paragraph 86? I think, there we are. The background to this is important because by the time I got involved with the family directly, we'll come on to this later, there was already a great deal of anger and upset. PERC were responsible for family liaison. My point of contention in this case is that they weren't dealing with it properly. I felt like I needed to see the family because it wasn't at the forefront of PERC's mind. On the day in question, they didn't have the flows out. They weren't even on duty. That wasn't good enough. I raised that a couple of times directly with PERC. Their recommendation was, it is fine, we'll see them tomorrow. I disagreed. I said we can't leave the family overnight. They needed to be briefed and made aware. It was wholly inappropriate. So I'm interested in this paragraph. You said that they didn't have flows on duty. And was the decision that the PERC were to supply the flows rather than the police?
So, I mean, I know now, having read a couple of the statements, that there was dialogue between Pat Campbell and Keith Harrow around who was going to take responsibility for the flows. For me, it didn't really matter who took responsibility for it. It was the fact that we needed to get flows deployed, and the fact of the matter was, and I know I'm jumping forward a few hours, but by 5:15, 6:30, there were still no flows deployed in that family. And to me, that's wholly a sort of woeful response, no matter how you try and paint that picture.
Mm. And you say that it wasn't good enough. You raised it a couple of times directly with PERC. Can you tell us a little bit more about when and who you raised it with?
So there was a number of discussions around flows and, you know, concerns, you know, and I do remember having at least one conversation with Keith Harrow about flows, but it was back to capacity. I don't actually, and I don't know if Keith's been in here yet or not, I've not seen.
We'll hear further evidence from PERC next year, I think.
Right, okay. I mean, for me, you know, I think they didn't have the capacity. It was a Sunday. They couldn't source them potentially. I think Police Scotland had a similar challenge. But for me, we didn't do enough to get the flows out to the family. And
you've said there that PERC recommended just leaving flows till the next day, and you say we can't leave the family overnight. They needed to be briefed and made aware. You seemed quite insistent in that paragraph on that. Was that your view at the time?
Well, I know we're jumping forward, but that's why I went, because there was no flows on the horizon, to my knowledge. There wasn't going to be a deployment, so, you know, somebody needed to go and try and speak to the family, and, you know.
And then looking at paragraph 87, you say PERC couldn't muster flows and said they couldn't deploy until the following day, which I thought was wholly unacceptable. I can't remember which PERC officer did this. Keith Harrower was my main point of contact in the early stages, so I'm guessing it was probably Keith that told me that. PERC weren't keen on deploying Police Scotland flows. That was their decision to make. I understood that and why they made that decision. It's not good practice to have one flow on the Saturday and another on the Sunday. The preferred model is to have an agreed flow and have them right in from the off. That provides consistency and builds trust. The PERC preference was to have one on the following day. For me, waiting 24 hours before the family had been given a thorough, proper update on the circumstances was inappropriate. If it was my family and there was concern about the circumstances, and I wasn't being told for 24 hours, it would be devastating. So you understood the decision that PERC didn't want to have police flows. What was the basis for that?
I think that was probably moving on a little bit around that once the death messages, etc., had been presented. I mean, it was clear to me, and it was clear, I think, to everybody at that point, that to then introduce Police Scotland flows into that family dynamic was not going to add any value because of the distrust that had come because of me and my team's the policing PERC's previous inaction over the course of that morning.
And in terms of your impression, was there any concern about the police providing flows and the police being investigated? That sort of conflict there?
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't think in a situation such as this one, which is, as I say, thankfully very unique, the flows should be Police Scotland flows. I think they should be part of that independent. I mean, the PERC had oversight of this investigation. The priority surely had to be the family. So if you're going to deploy your most important assets anywhere, it has to be to the family.
And it would have been PERC flows that would have been the most suitable?
In my view, certainly.
And can we go back, please, to, sorry, we're flipping between two parts of the statement. Can we go back to 47, please? And here you say, my view was the community tension impact reassurance would be led by my teams, and I wouldn't expect PERC to do that. I wasn't fully cited on the progress of the investigation. That was for the SIO and then PERC. So it just becomes trying to ensure close collaboration and engagement. In the early stages, I wasn't reassured that the PERC were dealing and engaging with the family properly. PERC should be responsible for family liaison. They weren't providing flows, and that was a problem for me. And then if we can go back, sorry, to 84 and 85. Yeah. And you were also talking about flows in this section. You point out that you've never been a family liaison officer. The role tends to be constable or sergeant rank. When that role was brought into policing, it was probably in the late 90s to early 2000s when I was an SIO. I've used flows a lot. They play a vital role in any serious investigation. I was never a flow myself, but I've got a good awareness of flows. They're critical to the ability to assist and support a family, and there are really experienced flows that you'd use for certain types of cases, such as child deaths. You'd need a certain type of flow for that. I've utilised them many times. I'm interested, we've heard different evidence, we've not heard from the flows yet, but we've heard different evidence. Some think that the priority for the flow is the family and a welfare support type role, and others have said that they're actually part of the investigation team and liaising with the investigation team. Do you have, with your experience of using flows, can you help us understand that further?
Yeah, I think I touched on it earlier. I think it's both. I think it's family welfare, family trust, doing whatever needs to be done for the family in the first instance, but it's also too, it's a conduit for the investigation. So the SIO may have particular sensitive questions or points that they need to try and understand better, and if you have a good, well-trained, experienced flow, they can find those answers with the family in a more appropriate way.
Great. And then you make it clear in paragraph 85 that the flows were not your responsibility. So that wasn't part of your remit to arrange flows or any of that? No,
but why it was important to me was that it's back to the community trust and confidence. If you lose a family and they don't trust police as an organisation, what could happen is a very quick deterioration with other communities, with family, but also other communities. So it's about, really trying to work with the family in these circumstances.
Okay. So you can see the wider benefits from your perspective.
That was
right.
Yeah, that was one of the concerns.
And the flows, the responsibility of the flows was for Perk and Pat Campbell to arrange as part of the investigation.
Yeah.
So it was Pat Campbell, police for the police, and someone for the Perk to liaise on that.
Yeah, but the decision ultimately at that point would have been Perk's decision around who, when, and where were the flows deployed, because they were leading on this investigation.
Right. But you do say, as local commander, you still had a role to ensure the family were given an update as a priority. I think you've talked about the wider implications of that. And they'd tragically lost a family member. And it was vital in my mind that we were as engaging and being honest with them at the earliest possible time, without obviously compromising the investigation. Again, you repeat that honesty is coming out there in that part of the statement. You felt that was an important part of engagement with police.
Yeah, I mean, this case in particular, so there are some cases when you maybe can't be open and honest with an entire family. If you suspect foul play, for example, but this particular incident, there was absolutely no suggestion of that. So for me, it's about absolutely being open, honest, and engaging with the family as early as we possibly can.
And then at the end of that paragraph, you say, bearing in mind there may have been some sensitivities which the family couldn't be told, they could be given the key elements in a dignified and compassionate way. What became apparent to me was that they weren't getting the necessary updates, and it was leading to a great deal of upset and frustration. I then took the decision to go and visit them. So you took that upon yourself to do that. And when you mention key elements, can you help us understand what you mean?
Just exactly that. So whatever the case or incident may be, what's the information that I have to hand that would be relevant to the family and important to the family without compromising the investigation is one point. And the second point is, you do have to be careful, because at any time in the early part of an investigation, there's a lot of hearsay, there's a lot of false reporting, there's a lot of suggestions that may turn out to be absolutely factually incorrect. So you do have to caveat that with a family, because clearly whatever you tell them, it sticks with them as you would expect. So you just need to try and be careful and that you don't mislead them in any great degree. And try your hardest not to.
Finally on this, can I ask you to look at paragraphs 113 and 114? Let's start with 113. Visible leadership is important for a family. The bottom line is Perk waiting until the next day is wholly inappropriate. If the flows were deployed and that relationship was in place, then I wouldn't have gone to that house. It was because there was no plan and no relationship, and a family had lost a family member. Visible leadership was for a senior officer to go and tell the family all I could tell them. And so you were that embodiment of visible leadership that day.
I certainly tried to be, yeah.
And you think that was because Perk didn't have a plan, they hadn't got a relationship, and the family had lost a member of their family?
Well, there had been no contact at that point. So the only contact, as I understand it, that the family had with anybody was, a couple of death messages that were presented by a couple of young detectives. So no, I don't think they'd had the coverage and the contact they deserved.
You thought they deserved better than they received?
Up until that point, yeah, absolutely.
And then you say at 114, I spoke to somebody in the Perk, can't remember who, most likely Keith Harrower. They asked me not to go and said I was going to go because they didn't have somebody in place. That was because of what I would expect as a parent if they had very recently lost a member of the family. Can I ask you, when you say they asked me not to go, what do you mean?
So it was their investigation. The park were located in a different part of Kirkcaldy Police Station from me, so I chapped where the park were their door, and of course there's a bit of a build up to this around the death messages and the upset from the family as a precursor to this point. But what was clear from the feedback I was getting is that the family were, absolutely distraught with the first and second death message. And what was clear is somebody needed to be visible with that family. That did not really follow sort of proper, maybe not proper procedures, but maybe it was seen as a bit of an unusual step to take. And so, Park were not keen that I went to that house. But there was no plan B for me, so I took the decision to go.
If PERC had had resources in place and flows in place ready to go, or to go and see the family, would you have got involved?
I wouldn't have. Not that day. I may have 2 or 3 days later as the local policing commander for Fife. I might have went up just to give my sympathies, etc., etc. But I would not have went at that time if there were flows in place. No.
Can I ask you, you mentioned earlier, and you've mentioned it in paragraph 55 of your inquiry statement, an expression that it was a foot on the ball moment. Can I ask you just to expand on that?
So, obviously, there'd been the original flurry of activity, I suppose, the whole initial phone call, the police attending, the police contact, the tragic death at Sheck, the Gold Group meeting, the notification that Park were going to take oversight and responsibility for the investigation, but there were still certain things that were in train. So, and I don't know the ins and outs of it all, but there were still elements of the investigation that had already commenced. So it would be probably wrong to say, right, Park are going to be coming in the afternoon. Just to use Colette as an example, because you mentioned that, let's just leave Colette now. Let's just leave her in a room until the Park come here. So there were certain things that were already progressing that I think it was right for the detectives to follow through on them. So those that were in train were still being progressed, but rightly the Park were leading now. So we needed to await their arrival and then see exactly what they wanted to do with this investigation.
So were there specific elements of the investigation that were effectively put on hold until PERC came on board?
I don't actually know, because you'd have to ask Pat Campbell or others that were leading on the investigation, but there may have been things that, had Police Scotland retained the investigation, would have been progressed quicker than maybe they were, or than they weren't, because we were waiting on Park arriving.
Before I move on to the death messages which you've just mentioned, can I ask you something about evidence that we've heard from Colette Bell? That when she was in Kirkcaldy Police Office and she was giving a statement, and it was DCs Mitchell and Parker were the officers who dealt with her and gave her the first death message that was delivered. She told us that she'd provided details of Sheku Bayo's next of kin to the officers during that statement, and she also told them about Sheku Bayo's former partner, whose name was Connie. She was the mother of his oldest child, and I understood from her evidence, Colette Bell's evidence, that an arrangement was in place for him to go and see his oldest child that day. And so Colette had told the police in the hope that that could be avoided.
Yeah.
But Connie, apparently, she said, later heard of his death on Facebook. And I'm interested in your perspective about when a a person shares information about the next of kin, who they are, and arrangements that obviously won't be taking place now because the person's died, what would you expect officers to be doing with that information?
So, in the circumstances you present there, you would expect an immediate action to be raised for officers to go and find the ex-partner and make her aware. But at the same time, if you'd established the other members of next of kin, you would be looking to not to do it. The perfect world is do it all at the same time, but as close to near it, because you don't actually know. You don't know the relationships. Maybe that you have a sister or an ex-partner, and you don't know who is closest or otherwise, or how relationships are behind the scenes. But you would be looking to action some immediate contact to these people.
And we have heard evidence that by the second Gold Group meeting, which was at 2:40, that there was some discussion at that meeting about the next of kin and the identification of them. Do you remember any discussion about that at that meeting?
Vaguely, but not that I could add any value just now.
All right. Can we move on to the death messages? Now, I think in one of your inquiry statements you talk about the initial death message, and I just want to share with you what we've heard so that we know what we're talking about.
Okay.
So we've heard that the first death message was given to Colette Bell in the morning at Kirkcaldy Police Office by DCs Mitchell and Parker. And that was when she was in the office, and then she was given the death message, and then they took a statement from her at that time. There was no mention at that time of there having been police contact.
Okay.
And that was the first death message, if we can call it that.
Yeah.
And the second death message was then a message given to the Johnsons, Caddy and Addie Johnson. So given to the family, the next of kin was his sister. And that was technically the second death message, but the first that was given to Mrs. Johnson, his next of kin. That was about 3:10 in the afternoon. Again, initially no mention of police contact. And then the third death message was effectively the second time that officers went out to speak to Mrs. Johnson and her family. And that was again given by DC Mitchell and Parker a short time after the first time he'd spoken to Caddy Johnson. And that was the first time they'd mentioned police contact. So we're talking about those death messages as a first, second and third.
Yeah, okay.
But it was only the second and third that were specifically given to the Johnsons.
Yeah.
It's just so I know when I ask you questions
but
about it, we're
1, 2 or
talking
3.
about the same thing.
Yeah, that's fine.
So if we can look at PERC 00181, page 2, paragraph 2, so 181, and if we can look at this, and so page 2, paragraph 2, and you say, I've been asked about the initial, sorry, if we could go back to the first page, this is the statement that was given to PERC on the 24th of June 2015.
Yep.
We spoke about that earlier this morning.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have just let you see that. And you say, paragraph 2, I've been asked about the initial death message which was given to the family and the form of words used. When you say the initial death message, are you talking about the first one that was given to Colette Bell or the first one that was given to Addie and Caddy Johnson?
I think I'm actually talking about the second one that was given
Right.
to Addie and Caddy.
Thank you. I recall speaking to DS Dursley regarding officers who had attended and that the family were wanting to know more information. I advised DS Dursley to speak to Detective Superintendent Campbell and to see what information could be provided to the family to update them surrounding the circumstances. So you had spoken to DS Dursley at that time. Now, was that after officers had gone to speak to Addie and Caddy Johnson the first time?
Yes.
Tell us about that conversation.
So I remember I was actually in the office with Chief Inspector Shepherd and DS Dursley chapped the door, and he basically outlined that 2 detectives had been to the house with a form of words. The family were up in arms, deeply upset, and the form of words, was really basic. Was next. So I, as I said there, so it's not my role to make determination around form of words and death messages. So my advice was, look, you go and speak to the detective super. He literally in another room, and see what can be done, and he can engage with Perk and see, if we can try and improve the communication or the content of the messages.
So from that, can I assume you had no involvement in formulating the form of words?
No.
For the first visit to the Johnsons?
No.
And you'd not been asked for any advice or guidance in relation to that?
No.
Did you even know what the form of words were
Not the
before
first
they were
one.
delivered?
No,
Not the first one.
Not the first one.
And then in relation to the second one, you've obviously had this conversation with DS Dursley.
Yeah.
Did he then go and speak to, as far as you know, Detective Superintendent Campbell?
Yes, and I have read Graham's statement, albeit I've not seen him here.
Graham
but
Dursley.
He then talks about how he gets a second form.
Were you involved with that second form of words?
No.
Did you have any input into it?
No.
So that was something that was dealt with Campbell and Dursley, as
Yeah.
far as you're aware?
Yeah, certainly the investigation side.
Now, there's something in this statement that I'm a little bit confused about, and I'm hoping you can clear
Okay.
up for me. Again, it's page 2, it's paragraph 6. And it starts, Detective Superintendent telephoned myself with the form of words and also sent written confirmation that it had been agreed with Perk. And then you say I was at Glenrothes Police Station. My intention was to attend Kirkcaldy Police Office and pass the form of words to the officers. I telephoned the PIO Stevie Kay, the temporary inspector, who advised me that the officers had finished for the day and had left the office. I asked Stevie Kay to contact each officer individually and deliver the form of words to them. And I also sent the form of words electronically to make sure the message was accurate. Can you just help me understand, because you're talking about forms of words and telephoning and discussing them,
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem to relate to the family.
No, so if you look just below the label Police Scotland Management, so that was the cause of death, so that's sometime later.
Right.
That was once the post-mortem had taken place and the cause of death, so that's a totally different
That's totally different. I'll
message.
come back
Yeah.
to that
Okay.
actually, but that's got nothing to do
No.
with the family
No.
or the form of words or anything
No.
along those lines.
No.
Thank you. Right, can I ask you to look at in your inquiry statement, please? And we'll go to paragraphs 96 to 98. Right. So you've been told this, you were asked questions about the death message that had been delivered to the Johnsons. I've been told the death message was as follows. Following an incident this morning in the Hayfield Road area of Kirkcaldy, officers from Police Scotland have been attempting to arrest Ch during which time he became unconscious. Conveyed to hospital by Scottish Ambulance Service, and despite best efforts by medical staff, died shortly after 9 a.m. this morning. My understanding is this would be the third death message, the second time the Johnsons
Yes.
were delivered a death message. 97. It doesn't ring any bells specifically, but that sounds about right. My comments are that, and this is the crux of it for me, you need to tell the family more than that. There were clearly more questions that they have, and from memory the police officers that were present had been told not to answer any questions. For me, that was wholly inappropriate at that time, and we needed to take a more transparent approach. It had only inflamed matters. You needed to be open and transparent with the family, and that was the nub of it for me. 98. I didn't have a say in the content of the message. That was part of the investigation strand. That's because the family will be witnesses in the investigation. I'm interested in paragraph 97 in particular, so perhaps we could see the start of that on the screen. You say that this is the crux of it for you. You need to tell the family more than that. There were clearly more questions that they have, and from memory, the police officers that were present had been told not to answer any questions. Can you give me a little bit more about the background there?
So that was the conversation that I'd had with DS Dursley and or the two detectives, because after they passed the second message, they came back to the office, and I was they came up to my office, if you like, and I basically, or they were really quite upset themselves, because they'd been advised, I don't know by who, but they'd been advised to give the formal words and say nothing more. That's what you tell the family, which is impossible to do and is unrealistic, and is not what we should be doing. So that was that. We need to. We can't just regurgitate or keep repeating a sentence to a family that have lost a loved one. It's not the right thing to do, and the detectives and Graham Dursley identified and felt exactly the same.
What would be the right thing to do?
Well, the right thing to do would be to have flows in place that were fully briefed in the inquiry, and for them to go through their flow protocols and to build that relationship, and drip feed or give whatever information that they felt was the right information to give.
I know you've not been a flow. Do you feel there's any tension between officers giving a death message and a flow providing or drip feeding more information about the investigation? Do you think there's any difficulty there?
So I do, and I'm out of touch now, but I do understand there is the potential for that. Those that pass the immediate death message, the family could react badly to them, and then if they were the flows, then to try and rebuild that could be difficult. So best practice has, over the years, I'm sure, and over victims and witnesses' feedback, has sort of suggested that you're better to have somebody to give the death message, and then for the flows to come in just at the back of that, so they're not the ones that have presented your loved one has died.
Mm. So we've heard evidence. We've heard evidence from Sergeant Mitchell about this on day 35 of the hearing, and he spoke about his concerns about the death messages they were asked to deliver, that they lacked clarity around the events, and he knew the minute he read it out to the family they wouldn't be happy, and they'd kick off quite understandably because it never explained anything. And he spoke about knowing that you were going to go out at some stage later, and he wasn't very happy about going back a second time with another written statement to deliver to the family. Do you have some sympathy with that evidence?
With him, yeah, absolutely. It's you just, that is adding no value, and it's just creating more animosity and upset for the family, and it's also putting the detectives in a position that nobody would want to be in, really.
And if trust is being damaged and animosity is increasing, what impact does that have on you and the role that you were in taking on that time?
Yeah, so that's the knock-on effect that I've spoken about before, that's where that then is a major issue for the family, and rightly so, but it then can have an impact on community trust, community assurance, and members of the community can really begin to kick back quite significantly around that if they feel that the police have not been treating the family of someone who's died as a consequence of police contact. So
looking back at the events that day, and I know you've told us this was a unique set of circumstances. There's no police flows set out, there's no perk flows set out. There's been a number of death messages, different information's been shared. I think Mitchell took the view that he would have preferred not to go back a second time to the Johnsons and for you to go in. But looking back now, how do you think that could have been improved, the handling of that whole situation?
So, without trying to repeat myself, it's simple as, so I understand the giving a death message, so, you know, that probably should have been broadened out a little bit, but the immediate death message is one thing, but then it's about having the flow and the support there to move right in with the family and to then begin, you know, being there when the family are distraught, when they're going through their grieving process, which takes, you know, as we know, days, weeks, months, years even, but for flows to be there and just to be their support as best they possibly can. That was the bit that was missing. We didn't have that there to move in, to be with the family, and that's the inexcusable part of that.
And if they had experienced flows in place to take on that role immediately, you would then have not needed to go to the house
no,
at
absolutely.
all?
I would not have required to go. As I say, I may have went a few days later, but I wouldn't have went on that day.
Mm. Could you give me a moment, please? I'm conscious of the time.
15-minute break at this point. Ms Graham.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to your visit to the Johnson's house. Can we look at your statement PS 03136? This was your operational statement. And I'm looking at page 2, paragraph 7. And then we'll go on to page 3 in a moment. But if we can start there. About 18:10 hours, same date, accompanied by Chief Inspector Nicola Shepherd. I attended, this was to the Johnson's house,
Yeah.
and met with the sister of the deceased, Caddy, and her husband, Addy, and the deceased partner, Colette. We've heard that she was present when you attended. There were a large number of other family members present at that time. I took the lead during the conversation and gave a factual account of the circumstances as I knew them at that stage. I did reiterate that this was a very fluid and dynamic investigation with many witnesses being seen, and that I was unsighted on the detail of all statements provided. Did you know which statements had been provided at that point?
No, I would never, at Gold, we would never go into that level of detail, so no.
So where had the information about the events come from as far as you were concerned at that time?
Primarily the call card and also, to a degree, the briefing that DI Colin Robson had given.
To the Gold Group meeting?
Yes.
Right. And had you had an opportunity to look through the call cards?
Yes. Yep.
We've heard they're also called storm cards.
Yeah.
And then in summary, and I think we'll carry on reading this page, in summary, the information I provided was that at just after 7 a.m. that morning, a number of calls were received by the police about a black male in possession of a knife on Henry Road, Kirkcaldy, at its junction with Hayfield Road. Police officers attended the scene, and during attempted apprehension of the male, CS spray was discharged and police batons drawn. During this period, Sheku lost consciousness and the officers administered CPR until ambulance personnel took over. Sheku passed away at the hospital at 09:04 hours that morning. I thereafter explained that the PERC had ownership of the investigation and would undertake an independent inquiry into the full circumstances and would be making contact with the family soon.
Yes.
And so is that a summary of information that had come to you from the call cards and the briefing from Robson?
Yes.
And you explain that PERC will be making contact with the family soon. Did you know when PERC would be making contact with them?
No. No.
At that time. And then the next paragraph says the key questions posed by the family at this point were: A, why was this the first time they had been told that Sheku died during contact with the police? I could not answer this point directly, but made it clear that I wanted to be as open and transparent as I could be, and this was the purpose for my visit. B, why did the police not disarm him? I could not answer that. C, the family have been told it took 15 officers to control him. Why was this? I could not answer this, other than to confirm that a minimum of 6 officers had initially attended. D, why had the police taken Arran Crescent as a crime scene, the deceased's home address? I explained that this was because of the disturbance of property reported by the girlfriend when she returned home, made it important for investigators to secure any evidence. And you then go on to explain the family were understandably distraught. Can I ask you about this paragraph that I've just read? Let's look at the first question that the family were asking. When you say the key questions posed were, does that mean they asked a lot of other questions, but these are the ones you recorded in your statement?
Yeah, so just a couple of elements that are probably important is Chief Inspector Nicola Shepherd asked her to come up and, in advance of going, there was some key elements that I wanted to tell the family as a minimum, which are the ones in the previous paragraph, and we'd agreed that I would take the lead in the conversation, and Nicola, albeit I was never keen on me or indeed her noting any, it's so impersonal if you begin to start a grieving family to be taking comprehensive notes, but her role there was to, really absorb what was getting said, and then once we went back to the police station, she would document this as she did. There was another point I was wanting to bring out there, but I forgot, but I'll go back to you.
All right. So you discussed the approach that you were going to take.
Yeah, sorry. Your second question was there a number of other questions? Absolutely. When we arrived, I spoke to Addie at the door. Myself and Nicola went in, and off to the left, as it was the living room, and there were seats all the way around the living room, as you would absolutely understand, and very close family, probably a wider family, and friends may well have been there as well, and there were children, not really young tots, but probably teenagers that were in the kitchen and were coming. So it was a very busy household, and there were a lot of questions that were asked of me from various different places in the room. What I really tried to do was, Caddy and Addie, clearly Caddy in particular, was, it was her greatest loss, has been the sister. Addie, I can't remember if it was at that meeting or at a subsequent meeting, had sort of voiced that the family were really supportive of him being the spokesman for the family, which I thought was a great idea, because that allowed me someone in particular to try and focus on. But what happened, and it was absolutely natural, is as I then gave my initial summary, there was tears, upset, shocks, screams of surprise and shock and horror from the family. And then, multiple questions came from multiple areas, and I just really tried hard to focus on Caddy, Addie, Colette's mum, those that, everybody had lost there in that room, that was clear, but I tried to focus on them directly.
Right. So how many people were in the room with you?
And I never counted, but I would predict, upwards of teens, 18 maybe into 20, with, as I say, older, maybe teenage kids that were maybe in the kitchen and popping their head through. So it was a busy house, as you would imagine, with the circumstances.
Right. So let's go through these questions, if you don't mind. Why was this the first time they had been told that Sheku died during contact with the police? Now, can you explain that to me? Because we've looked at the death message earlier, and that Mitchell and Parker had delivered. And when I read that out to you, there was mention of the police and their involvement. Were the family saying the first time they'd heard about contact with the police was from you, or were they referring to the earlier meeting with Mitchell and Parker? I
think, to be honest with you, it was probably a bit of both. I think some family maybe, I don't know about the third death message, I don't know who was all in the room at that point, but there was certainly shock and surprise when I described, the police officers being there and batons drawn and, CS spray and that was clearly news, probably first-hand news of that detail.
When you say the questions were posed by the family, you've talked about the numbers in the room and the different people asking questions. You wouldn't be able to tell us who it was that asked that question, would you? No, and that particular question, that's Nicola summarising. That question was probably asked in 10 different ways, from 10 different, slightly different perspectives. So that's Nicola after the event trying to boil down the sort of themes of the questions, maybe more than the direct questions themselves. So it's not like question A was asked by one member of the family and you were then asked for an answer and then no one else spoke? No. Okay. And you say I could not answer this point directly, but made it clear that I wanted to be as open and transparent as I could be, and that was the purpose for my visit. I think you've explained that your purpose was for that reason. Was it because of this desire to be open and transparent that you did give additional information about the CS spray and batons? Yeah, I genuinely had
no concern about passing that information to the family. I mean, that was, and I did caveat it when I went in to say that, this is an ongoing dynamic investigation. Some of what I tell you today, and I'm paraphrasing, but some of what I tell you just now might change. That was the reality of it. But because, as I said in a previous submission, as in here, investigations change direction, and the witnesses come forward that change the perspective. So, I just wanted to be as open with the family as I possibly could be, but I caveated it with saying some of this might actually, might change. It might not be as I articulate it, but this is how I know it at this time.
All right, thank you. And then looking at B, you were asked, why did the police not disarm him? And you couldn't answer that.
Yeah, I wasn't there. So, they were asking about the knife, how big, what was the handle, where was it from? There were loads of questions coming out. Why did the police, why could they not take the knife off him? I mean, I wasn't there. I couldn't answer that. And, it'd only be the police officers that could provide that explanation.
We've heard evidence the police officers didn't give statements till the following month, the 4th of June. Was it your understanding at the time you were speaking to the family that Mr. Bio had been in possession of a knife at the time the police arrived and approached him?
Certainly the key point for me was, and this is why even right, and I wasn't there at the first thing in the morning, but when you get multiple calls coming in at 7 o'clock in the morning about a man in possession of a knife, and it's from independent sources, it's going to be true. The likelihood is that is going to be true. If you get one source or one call coming in, and maybe it's a drunken telephone call at 3 o'clock in the morning, then you'd have your suspicions that it might not be true. But at 7 o'clock in the morning, various different sources, there is no doubt in my mind that was, and of course it came to fruition that was exactly the scenario that played out, and that there was a man there, and at some point the likelihood is he was in possession of a knife.
At this time, when you went to speak to the family, was it your impression from what you knew that Mr. Bio was in possession of a knife when the police arrived?
I don't think I had a clear position in my head around that, to be honest with you. I knew the calls had come in, but I didn't know if he was physically in possession of the knife when the police arrived, whether it was in his waistband, whether it had been dropped, whether, so I didn't have a clear position.
Right. And in the absence of any statements from the officers, you didn't have more detail about that?
No.
Question C. The family have been told it took 15 officers to control him. Why was this? Who had given the family that information?
I don't know.
Right. We've not heard any evidence to suggest that 15 officers were required to control Mr. Bio. Can you explain how families can get misinformation about this?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that was in this case, but you do find it is remarkable if you believe what witnesses tell you. There is hundreds of thousands of police officers in Scotland, because if there's an incident, it's 10 police vans that arrive with 30 members of staff, and the reality is there was probably in that situation there was probably 3 police vans and 5 members of staff. So it does that these numbers do tend to get exaggerated. It's just people at times over dramatise. I'm not saying that's what happened here, but that can happen. That's not unusual.
All right. And you said that you couldn't answer that other than to confirm that a minimum of 6 officers had initially attended.
Yeah.
And where was that information from that you had?
So either the Storm call card or Colin Robson's update.
Right. And then D, why had the police taken Arran Crescent as a crime scene? That was the deceased's home address. Did you know anything about that?
So I did know that the police had control of it whether again from Colin Robson's update or at the Gold when they were, talking about scene protection and taking control of scenes, and I was aware that the home address had been seized for the reasons there by the investigators to see if there's any evidence required there to be seized.
And that was because we've heard evidence from Colette Bell that she phoned in the morning and there were signs of a disturbance in the property. She'd reported that, the police had arrived and saw the signs of disturbance. And you said it made it important for investigators to secure any evidence. Was that your understanding?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's fair. That investigators would do that at the beginning of an investigation such as this. The methodology and the mindset, rightly, is you scale up to scale down. If you seize certain places or equipment, once you have control of it, you can always give it back. But you can't, if you've lost control of it, you can't then recover any forensics that might be there. So you're better to seize in the first instance.
Were you asked any other questions by the family about other properties?
Not that I recall, to be honest with you. It's too long ago.
All right. There's certainly nothing mentioned in your statement about that. We've heard from Caddy Johnson in evidence, we've heard from Colette Bell, and the chair has the benefit of certain statements, written statements that have been produced by people such as Addie or Lorraine Bell. That they were told that it was a forceful arrest, and that I think specifically Colette Bell said that when you came to the house you talked about it being a forceful arrest. And do you remember if you used those words, forceful arrest?
No, I have been asked that, I think, in one of the statements, and I genuinely don't remember using that phrase.
I mean, regardless of whether you used that particular phrase or not, do you accept that the description you gave to the Johnsons of the officers' actions were officers using force?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's been a use of force presented there, yes.
Thank you. And can I ask you about something else that Colette Bell has said in her evidence? Have you listened to Colette Bell's evidence?
No. No.
So she gave evidence about your visit to the house and has talked about what you told them, that you used the phrase forceful arrest. She remembered you saying that Sheck had gone towards them, the officers, with a knife. Do you remember if you said that to the family?
No, not because I didn't actually know that to be the case or not at that point, so I do not remember saying that.
All right.
I will have said that there was reports that he was in possession of a knife, because I knew that to be from the witnesses that came in, but not that, no.
Right. And she gave evidence that she had said, "So you battered him to death." And this is a quote from what she said, "And I still remember it now. He went like this. He just raised his hands, shrugged his shoulders as if to say, 'Don't know,' and that will never leave me." And she says, "I remember thinking, are you serious? You're shrugging your shoulders. Like, is it you don't know or is it you don't care? I remember him shrugging his shoulders and being so angry, thinking, are you serious? Like you're shrugging your shoulders." Do you remember if you were shrugging your shoulders?
Yeah, and I have seen, I think I saw that in the news actually. I've not, but I read that or seen it or whatever, and it actually genuinely upset me, because I would never have, I wouldn't do that. That's not in my nature. I would not dismiss. I mean, the whole reason for me being there, the whole precursor is, hopefully it's come out here today, is that the family and immediate family and secondary family were of absolute paramount importance. And I would never dismiss a statement such as that. I mean, I declared a critical incident. I put it on as the most important policing event in my police career. I would never have shrugged my shoulders and dismissed that. The only sort of explanation I can give is when, because of the multiple questions that I was getting asked, Colette may or may not have said that, and I may well have been answering or having a conversation with another member of staff, and so that can be my only explanation to it, because I certainly was not conscious of doing it and would never do that.
So, bearing in mind what Colette said, if you did shrug your shoulders at some point during that visit, was it because you didn't know the answer to something, or was it because you didn't care about the answer?
I certainly cared about what had happened to that family. So that's what I was trying to say. If I had shrugged my shoulders, I may well have been answering a slightly different question. I don't recall shrugging my shoulders, but I certainly would not have shrugged my shoulders at that question that Colette had asked me.
And then she also talks about you being, she says, I just remember him being quite hasty with information, and maybe it was hasty or unsure. And I asked if about that phrase, he was unsure, and she said unsure. I think he was not very confident with the information that he was giving us, or uncomfortable with the information that he was giving us. Do you have any comment to make about that impression?
So, I think maybe what she's saying around unsure might be fair, because I'm in that room and getting asked tens of dozens of questions, a lot of which I did not know the answer to. So I would come across as a bit unsure. But yeah, I would accept that. What was other? So unsure maybe of certain.
I think he was not very confident with the information that he was giving us, or uncomfortable with the information that he was giving us.
Yeah. Would I appear uncomfortable? I mean, if I'm being honest, the environment, the situation was uncomfortable. I'm faced with a family who are absolutely distraught, and really, really, I can't overemphasise how upset they were, and I'm there trying to explain the situation as it was that I understood it. So it was a difficult situation.
Can I ask you to go back to your inquiry statement for a moment, paragraphs 124 and 125. In 124, I've now seen the statements from one or two of the family about how they now feel about my visit on the 3rd of May 2015, and indeed my ongoing efforts to remain in contact with them afterwards. And those sadden me, because I genuinely sought to do what both I and the ACC considered to be the right thing to do. I was respecting the family by trying to give detail that others, mainly Perk, had failed to give. And at 125, I have no desire to add to the hurt of the family by getting into a dispute about what was said or how it was said by me. I tried my best to answer their questions based on what knowledge I had. I do not agree with the recollections some have of the detail of that meeting. I recollect it differently, and did not leave the house under the impression that I personally was the object of any frustration or anger, as opposed to the wider concern about the police. That said, I appreciate that for a grieving family in an emotionally charged situation, some of the facts were hard to accept. It was, I am sure, a shock to learn that Sheku had been seen with a large knife. No family wants to hear that. The alternative, however, was leaving the family in ignorance, and that was, in my view, worse. And I'd like to ask you about those paragraphs. You've said that you were doing your best to answer questions, and you don't agree with the recollections some have of the detail of the meeting. Is there anything specific that you want to add in relation to what you said in these paragraphs?
Not directly. I mean, I genuinely, I went to that house to to try and provide the family with some information that they hadn't had before, and I felt that it was the right thing to do, and I'm genuinely sorry if it didn't come across that way.
Thank you. Can I ask you about something that Caddy Johnson said in her evidence? She was asked about her recollection of your meeting, and this was in January of this year, day 34. And she said that her recollection was that you had said Sheku was holding a machete, and when she reacted to that and asked machete, you said it might be a blade or it might be a knife. You weren't quite sure what the weapon was. Can I ask you about the use of this word machete? Do you remember if you used that word during the conversation with the Johnsons?
I genuinely don't know.
You don't remember?
I don't.
Is it possible that you did use that word when you were speaking
Yeah,
to them?
it is possible. Yeah.
We've heard evidence from Conrad Trickett in relation to his PIM log, and he said that he was briefed by you at 5 to 10 in the morning when he got to Kirkcaldy, and he then retrospectively recorded that briefing with you, and he had recorded the word machete, that Mr. Bai was coming at officers with a machete. So do you think it is possible that during that day that is a word that was used by you?
Yeah, I do. You know, I genuinely don't recall saying it. It is in policing terms and in sort of media terms, it is a very commonly used word, machete. You know, I'm sure you could do the due diligence, but the level of calls that come into the police about males or females with machetes, it's a very common actually. I suspected this question would come up, and I googled this morning on the train, and you know, in the last 2 weeks there's been multiple reports of men, predominantly men with machetes. It's a very common term. I don't recall saying it, but I may well have said it.
And what does that word mean to you as a police officer?
A very large knife.
And does it have any connotations in your experience in relation to race or anything along those lines?
No, none whatsoever, no.
Caddy also gave evidence before I move on to another passage of her evidence, in using the word machete and the understanding you have, do you think that would alter or impact on the investigation in any way?
From the point that I became involved, or?
Well, just in any respect, if the word large knife is used or the word machete is used, would that make any difference in terms of how the investigation is directed or how it proceeds?
No, I mean, it's the bottom line is, was the individual thought to be in possession of a lethal weapon, a large knife or machete, would both achieve the same aim. So they're both lethal weapons, so it wouldn't make any difference. The definition of a machete, I think, in the dictionary is a large knife, so it would make no difference.
Would it make a difference if the people directing or leading in the investigation think that someone came at officers with a large knife or a machete, as opposed to simply having been seen by members of the public at an earlier stage with a large knife or a machete?
Would it impact? Sorry,
would that impact on the investigation if the people leading the investigation take the view that he's approached officers brandishing or holding a machete or a large knife?
No, not at that. I mean, the bottom line, the sad reality was that, you know, Sheku was dead at that point, so there was no accused person, you know. So the fact that it had been a large knife, machete, or any other lethal weapon would come out in the cold light of day when statements and witness statements were given, but it would not have any impact on the immediate course of action. No.
I was about to move on to Caddy's other evidence. She talked about you telling them that Sheku had punched a policewoman, the policewoman fell, and he stamped on the policewoman. And that was the first time that we heard all of that. And that was from yourself. Do you remember telling them about that?
Not in that level of detail. I may have. I genuinely don't recall that specifically, but I did go into detail as I knew it around, Sheik, running towards the police. That was, or I'm now beginning to sort of just use phrases, but that sort of connotation around that confrontation between the police officers and Sheku and Hayfield Road.
Do you remember who told you that he had run towards the police?
So I don't remember directly. It would be Colin Robson, Stevie Kay, most likely one of those two, because they were the two that had given me the briefings in the morning.
Right. Do you remember how you found out about the punch and the stamp?
How I found out? That I think that from memory was later on. That was when the detail began to emerge later.
And when you say later, do you mean after your meeting with the family?
Yes.
Right. Can I ask you to look at a statement from Addie Johnson, please? Perk 00182, I think. You were asked about this. Uh, 182 is your statement, and I think you were asked about it, so I'll ask. Sorry. And I'm interested in page 2, paragraph 7 to page 3. I'm wondering if I've got the right statement here. Yes. Yes. So page 2, paragraph 7. So this is your statement to Perk. Investigator Sinclair, that's someone who works with Perk,
Yep.
has informed me that during the Perk investigation, a statement was noted from a witness, and this is Addie Johnson's statement, who within his statement has mentioned that when Chief Inspector Shepherd and myself attended to inform the family about the incident, that I said I should not be telling you this. I have apparently told the family that the police had received 3 phone calls from a taxi driver, someone in a flat close by, and a passerby. It has been said that I informed the family that the incident occurred during a changeover of shifts and that the report was of an African man wielding a machete in the middle of the road. I have apparently told the family that 6 officers were dispatched to the scene, that the officers had spoken to Sheku, but he had refused to drop the machete. As a result, the officers had pepper sprayed him, that Sheku had then moved towards the officers, and that the police officers used their batons. I have reportedly told the family that Sheku kicked a policewoman and stamped on her head. I've then told them that the police officers continued to use their batons, and it was at this time they realised Sheku was no longer breathing. CPR was commenced, and an ambulance attended, and Sheku was removed to hospital where life was pronounced extinct at 9:04 hours. In relation to the comment, I should not be telling you this, I do not recall using that language, and as per my statement I made it clear that my attendance at the house was to be as open and transparent to the family as I could. Now there's a lot of information in that paragraph. Perhaps we can go back up to the start of it. And can I ask you, first of all, do you remember saying to the family, I should not be telling you this?
No, definitely not. That I was there to tell them things, so no, I didn't say that.
Right. Did you tell them that the police had received 3 phone calls from a taxi driver, someone in a flat close by, and a passer-by?
No. I probably told them that there had been multiple calls received. I didn't have the level of detail around taxi driver, flat close by. I mean, I certainly was not aware of that level of detail. If indeed that's true, I don't know.
Right. I mean, at some stage, did you receive information about who had made the calls? We've heard from the people who made the calls.
Yeah.
There were 6 calls.
Yeah.
One of the people, Mr. Kohlberg, phoned twice.
Okay.
Did you know at that stage who these people were or what their jobs were or any of that information?
No, genuinely I didn't. I mean, I wouldn't, and actually, you know, until reading that or when I previously read that, I don't get access. I don't need to know that level of detail, and it's not something that I would have been cited on.
So from your own recollection, at the time you visited the Johnsons on the 3rd of May 2015 after 6 o'clock, was any of that information known to you?
Multiple calls, yes. Flat close by, passerby, taxi driver. None of that rings a bell with me.
All right. It has been said that I informed the family that the incident occurred during a changeover of shifts. And would that be correct?
So I would, or I could have said that, yes, because I think with the timing it probably was, you know, a shift probably had just finished, so I would say that would be fair, yes.
Mm-hmm. And that the report was of an African man wielding a machete in the middle of the road.
Yeah, I mean, no, I didn't use that terminology.
I've apparently told the family that 6 officers were dispatched to the scene. Did you tell them that?
That's about a minimum of 6, yeah.
And that the officers had spoken to Sheku, but he had refused to drop the machete.
I didn't have that level of detail.
We've certainly not heard any evidence to suggest that that
No,
is
not really.
accurate in any way.
No.
I mean, do you remember hearing anyone telling you that
No.
was the way things...
Until I'd read that, I'd never heard that. That's not come out of my mouth.
As a result, the officers had pepper sprayed him. Do you remember telling them that?
So, no, I don't. I was surprised at that because I never used the phrase pepper spray. It's not a CS spray would be my terminology.
We've also heard that Pava spray was used.
Or Pava, yep.
Would you call that pepper spray?
I would call it CS, but Pava is, I think, the more modern, but it must be a dinosaur, but Pava is the more modern equivalent to CS. Pepper spray is a non-policing term for CS.
All right. And following, as a result, the officers had pepper sprayed him, that Sheku had then moved towards the officers, and the police officers used their batons. Do you remember seeing that?
So, again, I didn't, because, you know, the only people that knew if batons had been used or not used at that point were the police officers that were probably still in the canteen at that time, I'm not sure. And I'd never asked them that question, and I would be surprised if anybody else had asked them that question. I knew that batons had been drawn, but I didn't know that batons had been used at that point.
We've heard evidence from PC Tomlinson, who said that he did use his baton that day. So at least there was one baton being used in relation to Mr. Vile. I've reportedly told the family that Sheku kicked a policewoman and stamped on her head.
Yeah, I mean, no, I didn't. Stamp on her head, no. And kicked a policewoman, I don't recall saying that.
All right. I have then told them that the police officers continued to use their batons, and it was at this time they realised Sheku was no longer breathing. Do you remember telling the family that police officers continued to use their batons?
No, I mean, I didn't know that batons were used. I knew that batons had been drawn, but I didn't know they'd been used, so I didn't know they'd continued to be used, no.
When did you find out that battens had been drawn?
Again, probably at either from DI Colin Robson or DI Inspector Stevie Kay.
And would that have been earlier in the day?
Yeah, yes.
And how would they have known that? We heard there were no statements until the 4th of June.
I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I don't know if was there battens left at the scene. I can't remember now.
Right.
I think their battens may have been left at the scene, so by default they'd been removed from their casing.
Right. CPR was commenced and an ambulance attended, and Sheka was removed to hospital where life was pronounced extinct at 09:04 hours. And I think we've heard that's correct, that he was taken by ambulance to Victoria. In relation to the comment, I should not be telling you this, I do not recall using that language. So you simply don't remember using that phrase?
No, I went up there to tell the family things. I would not have started by saying I shouldn't be telling you. I mean, my ACC knew that I was going to be doing this, so that, for me there was no secrets. So
it wasn't an attempt to build rapport or to...
No, I think at best I probably would have been better saying something along the lines that I should have been telling, or we should have been telling you this earlier, rather than I shouldn't have been telling you this.
And you say, is that, looking back, what you think might have been a better approach?
Yeah, I think the minute that I met with the family, I felt at that immediate point that this should have happened hours before. This conversation should have happened, not necessarily with me, but with somebody who was prepared to give the family, out of respect to them and the fact they'd lost a loved one, more information.
Now, and this is obviously comments taken by Perk from a statement from Addie Johnson. And if we can just take that at face value for the moment, can you think of any reason why Addie Johnson would say you did say these things?
No, I genuinely can't. What I have, families, when they're in such a state of shock, it clearly will not be, their recollection will not be as good as it could be, but also my recollection won't be as good as it could be as well. I do absolutely accept that. The purpose of Nicola Shepherd for me being there, however, was, and I mentioned at the pre-brief, was she was not independent, but she was there to take a step back, if you like, and listen to the dynamic and the conversation, and then download a hot debrief of the high-level summary of the conversation. That was the purpose of Nicola being there. And so for me, the independent, most accurate record of that conversation was most likely to come from Nicola than me, or indeed perhaps from the family.
Could I ask you to look at, or maybe we don't need to go and have this on the screen. I'm going to read out some other comments that have been made from Addie Johnson in relation to an inquiry statement that's been produced. So he was asked about for those in the room that may want to know, it's SBPI 00248. And he was asked about this visit by you. He said he had been updated or something like that, and then he said the officers got phone calls from a member of the public that a man with a machete was on the street. So he's referring to what you have explained to the family. When he used the word machete, everybody shouted in the room, and then everybody calmed down for him to continue. Do you remember that happening?
I don't remember saying the word machete, but I do remember, I remember the family, up and down, emotional sort of roller coaster. That certainly was the case.
Then he said that when the officers turned up, it was 5 officers, including a female officer. Do you remember saying that?
No, I thought I said a minimum of 6, but yeah.
We've heard that PC's Walker and Payton were the first to arrive, and then PC Tomlinson and PC Short. PC Short is a female, were the second car to arrive, and then there were other officers that arrived after that were involved. So to that extent, there was a female officer called Nicole Short.
Yeah, no, I did know that she was there, and I did know by the time that was meeting with the family, I did know that Nicole had been there. Yes.
Right. He said that when they turned up, they met Sheku with the machete in his hand, and they tried to talk him down so that he drops the machete, but he refused. He said that Sheku punched a female officer, and it was at that point, he said, that the female officer fell and he stamped on her head. And he said it was at that point that all the officers used their batons on him, and it was when they stopped that they realised that Sheku was not breathing. And he was unconscious, and they called the ambulance, and he was pronounced dead on the way to the hospital. So that was your story, your first story. So again, that seems, on the face of it, to mirror the comments that were given originally by Addie Johnson in the statement that was put to you by Perk. So again, is your position on that exactly the same as you've already told us? Yeah,
I certainly didn't say a number of those things, and I didn't have that level of detail to be saying them.
All right. Could you just give me a moment?
Yeah, of course.
Please? You mentioned Shepherd taking some notes, and I think in fairness, I'd like to just say to you what she's indicated. So, and you can then comment on it. I'll read it out.
Okay.
So this is from PS 00643, Chief Inspector Nicola Shepherd. Chief Superintendent McEwan took the lead in the conversation with the family and explained that the purpose of the visit was to provide them with our understanding of the events from a police perspective. It was emphasised that this was not a factual account but what had been provided to us up to this point. It was also made clear that many witnesses to the events were still to be seen and the situation was still fluid. Is that pretty much what you said earlier?
Yeah.
And then she goes on to say, in summary, Chief Superintendent McEwan explained to all those present that about 0700 hours that morning, a number of calls were received by the police from members of the public about a black African male in possession of a knife on Henry Road at its junction with Hayfield Road. Officers had just commenced duty and left to attend the call from the police station at Kirkcaldy. The officers attended the scene, and during the apprehension of the man, CS spray was discharged and batons withdrawn. During this, officers became aware that now deceased had lost consciousness. The officers administered CPR and called for an ambulance. Now deceased was pronounced life extinct at 0904 hours that morning. So does that accord with your recollection?
Yes, and as I say, I mean, that was the purpose of Chief Inspector Shepherd being there, was to absorb what I said, because it was such a frantic and, difficult conversation with many questions coming. It was important that she could just take a step back and actually try and absorb and summarise, which is done there, the nature of the conversation.
Can I ask you to look at another document that contains some information that was, as I understand it, raised at the Gold Group meeting at 1440 hours. So this is PS 06514, and it's the handwritten minutes, not the typed version that we looked at earlier. And it's not very easy to read. But it's on page 2 near the top. Keep going, please. Right, so you'll see there at the top, this is at the top of page 2, you'll see it says male went for female. Can you see that on the second line?
Yeah.
On ground, kicked to head. Male stopped breathing, CPR commences. As I think it says locus protection in place. During struggle, he lost control of knife, photographed knife, batons recovered. Now, this is handwritten notes taken during the Gold Group meeting at 1440. And it seems that it doesn't provide the source of that information. But do you remember that being part of the conversation at that meeting?
Not 8 years on, not specifically, but and I assume that was D.I. Robson's part of his summary, but I if you don't know the provenance, I'm not sure, but...
So if it's correct that those notes were taken at the time of that Gold Group meeting, which you attended,
Yeah.
someone had given this information to everyone in attendance about the female officer being kicked to the head, and during the struggle he lost control of a knife, which suggests that that was something he had in his hand during that struggle. So it would appear that that information was available to you during that Gold Group meeting. Is it possible that you had relayed that information to the family when you went after 6?
Possibly. I genuinely don't remember saying it, and I've never seen that handwritten note, but yeah, possibly.
Thank you. Can I ask you to go back to your inquiry statement, please? And if we can look at paragraphs 172 and 173. Right, this relates to the Gold Group meeting at 1440. And you were asked about the handwritten note, P.S. Warrender's handwritten note. We've just looked at that. And then at 173, you say, I don't remember this being said. At that time at 2 in the afternoon, it wouldn't have had an impact either way. The fact that he was in possession or not in possession, I was genuinely unsighted on that. That hadn't become clear in my mind at that point. The kick to head, I don't remember. Maybe more that she was assaulted. I thought it was a stamp more than a kick. I'm struggling to remember. I'm quite interested in just maybe getting a further explanation of this paragraph. You say it wouldn't have had an impact, the information about him struggling and losing control of the knife and having been involved with the female officer. The fact he was in possession or not in possession, I was genuinely unsighted on that. What does that mean?
It means I didn't know. There had been no... That level of detail was only known to the police officers that had attended, and of course none of them had given statements, so I was unsighted on that level of detail.
So were you reliant on what was said at the Gold Group meetings to sort of provide that further detail?
So, the person that had the greatest detail at the Gold Groups around, the early part of the investigation or the incident was D.I. Colin Robson. But no one, not even Colin, would have known exactly what happened because he wasn't there at the time.
And you say the kick to the head, I don't remember. Maybe more that she was assaulted. I thought it was a stamp more than a kick. I'm struggling to remember.
Yeah.
And we've not heard any suggestion, any evidence to suggest that Mr. Bio was in control of a knife or a machete or struggling and lost control of it during his involvement with the contact with the police. In terms of the information that seems to have been being discussed at the Gold Group meeting, insofar as that doesn't seem to have been accurate. Does that misinformation being shared at the Gold Group meeting have an impact on the approach taken by the Gold Group or the approach taken in the investigation?
No, I genuinely don't think so. That's what I was trying to say earlier. Is if Sheku was still alive and the investigation was around did he or did he not assault the police, then this would be really important. But the fact that he tragically passed away, him being accused of anything was almost irrelevant. It was more around what led to the lead up to Sheku dying was the important part of the investigation. What transpired there. So, what Sheku had done or not done was important, but for me, or not for me, in a general sense, that was maybe not the most important aspect of it.
So not relevant to Mr. Bio, who's deceased, but we've heard evidence that individual police officers have to justify individual uses of force. So if they strike someone with a baton or discharge their CS spray, they have to justify that. Would information about the use of potentially fatal force, such as a baton strike to the head or a justification for using a spray, would it have an impact on that and the way that the actions of the officers are perceived?
I mean, this information here, it's all hearsay that, I'm not saying it's not relevant, but what is relevant is what happened that morning at 7:10. What the witnesses that phoned in tell you, what the police witnesses tell you, and what other witnesses, eyewitnesses that were there can tell you. That's the really relevant part. The fact that a Gold Group meeting, that that information that may or may not be, probably suggest some of it's inaccurate through that briefing. It's not helpful, but it would not change the direction of the inquiry.
Right, thank you. I'm conscious of the time.
Could you come back tomorrow morning to continue with your evidence, please, Mr.
Certainly.
McEwan? We're adjourned until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.